Thank you for joining me on my serialized podcast, 9 Lives. It's a collection of true stories about my life adventures, risk-taking, and near-death experiences. 9 Lives covers a timeline of 40 years, from 1960 up to the year 2000. I invite you to join me in this series of true and incredible accounts of thrilling adventures and more than a few occasions when it all might have ended for me. Welcome to episode 4 of 9 Lives, which I call Terror in Tehran. Do you remember where you were on November the 4th, 1979? I certainly do. I was in Tehran. On that infamous day, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy, taking more than 60 American hostages, who remained captive for 444 days. For me, it was just another day at the office. I had been traveling to Iran for almost 4 years and spent about a week to 10 days each month in Tehran. My recollection of Iran was always a beautiful country with lots of diversity and very friendly people. Although I traveled extensively throughout Iran, most of my time was spent in Tehran, where I had many friends with whom I spent a pleasant time during my regular visits. While there, I would regularly stay at either the Hilton Hotel or the Intercontinental, both of which maintained the highest international standards. On this occasion, I was staying at the Intercontinental, where I had been for the past couple of weeks. My departure was scheduled for November the 5th, following a few last-minute meetings on the first day of the Iranian week, which always included a short 10-minute meeting with the head of the organization that I was working with in Iran. It was simply a courtesy visit to explain what had gone on during the time that I was there and to hear about any issues that needed to be attended to before my next visit. This meeting would usually occur late in the afternoon, after which I would usually have dinner with friends, pack and get ready to leave the following morning for London and onwards to the United States. Monday, November the 4th, 1979, started out as just an ordinary day. Breakfast at the Intercontinental, with some informal last-minute meetings with colleagues in Tehran. However, that was about to change, when around 8:30 I received a call from the secretary of the official that I've been working with. She asked if I could come for an earlier meeting than the late afternoon one, and could I be at his office by around 10:30 that morning. Unknown to me, it was exactly the time that the Iranian students had stormed the U.S. Embassy, where I'd gone frequently around this time during my stays in Tehran. At first, I gave no thought to this change of plan, but it was different than what had happened over the last 4 years. So, grabbing a cab from the Intercontinental, I arrived for the meeting on time at 10:30. I was greeted with a smile by the attractive secretary of the senior executive, with who I would always engage in conversation about what was going on around the world. She was a beautiful Iranian woman in her early 30s, who had been educated in England and therefore appreciated some of the British humour that I'd hand out from time to time. She apologized that the meeting might be delayed a little because her boss had been called to an unscheduled meeting which should not take much longer. Knowing that meetings with high-ranking officials do get delayed, I would always take a book with me. So I settled in for a quiet read in the comfortable outer office of the executive. As the time ticked by, the pretty secretary would pop out and offer me tea or coffee, together with a few Iranian delicacies. Just after noon, the secretary came out and told me that her boss had just returned and had asked that I would join him on the roof garden for lunch. Something that I'd never done over the last 4 years, when our meetings were short and to the point. I was escorted to the roof garden, where there was a beautifully laid-out private restaurant, the standard of which you'd probably only find in a top-class hotel. I was ushered to a beautifully laid-out table where the executive was already seated. He greeted me with the usual friendliness that I'd become accustomed to from the Iranian colleagues, and he apologized profusely for the delay in our meeting. We had a pleasant discussion about how things were going on the project, including details of the next phase of the project, which was unusual, because this senior executive rarely delved into the details of the project. I was becoming surprised by the length of time that he dedicated to our meeting, but he seemed comfortable in taking that time. We had a sumptuous lunch of international and Iranian cuisine. It was a bright, sunny but relatively cool day in Tehran, with a light, cool breeze making it a pleasant afternoon. Nothing could have been nicer. The time was now approaching 2 p.m., when all of a sudden one of the waiters came over and handed my friend a note. He read the note and nodded to the waiter, then turned to me and said, "Well, I must go now, but please have a safe trip home to the United States, and I look forward to seeing you again when you return." I said my goodbyes to everyone and left by cab back to the Intercontinental Hotel. By this time it was close to 3 o'clock, a time when a small crowd would be gathering for the afternoon get-together with afternoon tea or maybe a drink in the bar. By 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the lobby area in the bar would have about 100 to 150 people. But when I arrived, the lobby was empty, and there was no one at the bar. I just thought, well, it might be a quiet day. So I headed up to my room, and on the way thought, maybe I could get tonight's flight to London instead of tomorrow morning. On the way to my room, I noticed that the hotel was eerily quiet, but thinking no more about it, I packed and got ready to leave. I had done numerous impromptu departures from Tehran on previous occasions, and there were many options of flights to London, so I never worried about an advance reservation. I knew there was an Iranair flight that left Tehran at around 7 o'clock in the evening, arriving in London around 9. A 5.5-hour journey, with the 3-hour time difference between London and Tehran, made for an acceptable arrival in London in the late evening. It was now around 4:30. I was packed and ready to go. So I sat down to the reception desk, paid my bill, still noting that the lobby area was remarkably empty, with only a handful of people hanging around the bar. I got to the airport a little after 5 and started to look at what flights were available going to London that evening, knowing that the Iranair flight would probably be the best, with more seats available. However, when checking in, I was told there was just one first-class seat available. That was unusual because I'd taken this flight before many times, and the plane was usually half full. Checking in for the Iranair flight and going through immigration procedures and into the departure lounge, there was nothing to indicate that anything unusual had happened in Tehran that day. Even on the 5-hour flight to London, there was no talk about what had happened at the American Embassy that day in Tehran. It was an uneventful trip, landing on time, then heading to my usual hotel at London's Heathrow Airport. I checked in, but again nobody mentioned anything unusual happening in Tehran that day. I was tired, it had been a long day, and not needing an evening meal because I got that on the airplane, I headed straight to my room. And as was customary, I made a call home to let them know where I was. It would then be about 4:30 in the afternoon in the Central Time Zone. My wife answered the phone and alarmingly said, "Where are you?" knowing that I'd travelled to Tehran and was expected back the following day. She was a little surprised when I said, "I'm in London already." I could hear the relief in her voice, and a little shaky when she said, "If you're in the hotel, put on CNN. Something terrible has happened in Tehran, and I was worried you were caught up in it." I did as she said, and this was the first instance that I knew that something bad had happened, and that the unusual meeting at 10:30 in the morning in Tehran had been deliberately set to remove me from harm's way. I shall be forever thankful for that action taken by the senior executive, who I would meet again regularly on future visits to Tehran. At the time, I was not a US citizen and travelled on a British passport. British citizens were not being targeted in Iran. The same went for other nationalities, including the Swiss and Germans and French, many of whom worked for US companies still doing business in Iran. However, a number of large corporations had withdrawn their staff, among which was an American company that had just located 80 of its people in Tehran, providing them with luxurious accommodation, all of which was abandoned. I travelled back to Tehran for another 12 months following the return of Ayatollah Khomeini. I really didn't feel in any danger being there. But the international community had dwindled with the departure of most Americans. Being a Brit, even in a dire situation, I would try to find the bright side of things, and did so in coupling up with a German friend who also worked for the organization that I did. He had been the friend of an American automobile executive who was running a local assembly plant for automobiles in Tehran. He had evacuated along with his family, leaving a beautiful home within a hillside community overlooking Tehran. My German friend had offered to take care of the home on behalf of the company, and being telecommunications experts, we devised a way of being able to communicate to the outside world bypassing the Iranian telecommunications system. The home had a beautiful swimming pool, but we had better ideas for it. We drained the pool and installed an Inmarsat satellite system, through which we'd send daily reports to the United States and talk to our families in Germany and in the United States without the fear of being detected, proving that ingenuity always succeeds in adversity. I returned to Tehran every month for the next 12 months, but travel became more difficult because the international airlines, including British Airways, had ceased operations into Tehran. So the only reliable way to get in and out was through Athens, where Iran Air flew a daily flight from Athens to Tehran late in the evening. I took that flight regularly and noticed that over time the international travelers were dwindling. The flight would mostly be comprised of Iranian citizens who were still allowed to travel outside of Iran. My visits to Tehran were shortened, from the customary 10 to 14 days, down to 2 or 3 days. And at the international hotels, there were many times more staff than guests. I remember one night having dinner with a German engineer and a French reporter. We were the only guests in the Intercontinental Hotel. It was the closest hotel to the airport, but I decided to return to the Hilton, further away from the airport and a little more dangerous journey. But with more people there was a much easier feeling. I will forever remember my last trip to Tehran. Again, going in through Athens, arriving in Tehran just before midnight. Checking in at Athens, it was evident that there were not going to be many international travelers on this flight. As it happened, I was the only one. As we were about to board the flight, I heard 2 young women behind me chattering in Farsi, the national language of Iran. They seemed to be stuttering their words, and I could clearly smell alcohol coming from their breath. I turned around and faced them, and in English, which they clearly understood, I said, "Are you sure you should be getting on this flight tonight?" They seemed intent on doing so, but when I pointed out that when they arrived at Tehran, they could be arrested. After about a minute of thinking, they smiled at me, said thank you, turned around and got out of the line. That was a pretty lonely flight for me. Arriving in Tehran, going through immigration was pretty quick. There were 2 lines, one for Iranian citizens and one for foreigners. I was the only one in the foreigners line. And now, completing my commitment to the company that I worked for and the Iranian organization that had already paid for the services, I said a sad farewell to my friends in Tehran, never to return again. However, since that final trip, I've encountered a number of friends from those days in Iran who left Iran for a new life in Europe or the United States. Thank you for joining me on episode 4 of 9 Lives, and please join me again for episode 5 on May the 13th, when I'll recount how serendipity played a role in avoiding an airline hijacking that took place in 1976.